critic T.S. Eliot. He basically liked to call himself a classicist in literature. According to him, a critic is very important because it is a critic who raises the standards of literature. This is what he believed. So he thought of criticism as a science, and it was this theory that became quite revolutionary during the first half of the 20th century. And apart from this, he also gave tremendous propagation for the metaphysical revival in literature. He first recognized and he was accepted for the uniqueness of metaphysical poets of the 17th century. Eliot came with new ideas in criticism towards the end of the 19th century. He believed that from time to time it is desirable that some critic shall appear to review the past of our literature and set the poets and the poems in a new order. So this is why he believed that criticism is important. A critic is important. He gave a new direction and he also gave new tools for criticism. According to George Watson, Eliot made English criticism look different, but not in a simple sense. He offered it a new range of rhetorical possibilities, confirmed it in its increasing contempt for historical process, and yet reshaped its notion of period by a handful of brilliant institutions. So this, according to Watson, was the merit of Eliot. He gave a proper framework for criticism in English literature. He made it seem like a science, and he tried to place it above history. He believed that criticism was indeed very important in analyzing and also in bringing the poets and the poems in a new order. Now, the main discussions of the essay that we have to go through, tradition and individual talent, are given below. This essay was initially published in the magazine The Egoist, and later it was republished in The Sacred Wood. The entire essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, is divided into three parts. The first part talks about the concept of tradition. The second part talks about the theory of impersonal poetry. And the third part is, of course, a conclusion of what exactly a poem is and who exactly should be a poet. The first part, the concept of tradition. Now, in this part, Eliot speaks about what exactly is tradition. He says that seldom, perhaps, does the word tradition appear except in a phrase of censure. He means that in English writing, we do not see the proper use of the word tradition. And of course, it is not, even if it is used, it's not used in a positive way, because Englishmen have a different attitude towards the concept of tradition when compared to the French. Englishmen give importance to creativity rather than tradition. They give more importance to creativity rather than criticality. Whereas in French literature, there is a mass of critical writing that happens there. So Eliot says this is a basic difference between the attitude of an Englishman and a Frenchman. So we can only conclude that the French are more critical than we, the English, and sometimes even plumb ourselves a little with the fact as if the French were less spontaneous. So this is one thing that the English feels one step higher than the French. The Englishmen usually feel that they are more creative than the French people. Now, Eliot does not see this in a positive favor. According to Eliot, criticality is a bit more important than creativity. He thinks that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. According to him, the Englishman, while analyzing a poet, admires those aspects which are different from the poet's predecessors as they look for newness and uniqueness from every poet to praise them. So, the newness of a poet is given more importance in English literature by the Englishmen rather than how much of the tradition that these poets carry forth. Thus, Eliot says that if Englishmen keeps aside such prejudices, then one realizes that the poet's individuality is very much connected with his ancestors or with his tradition. According to Eliot, the most individual part of any work is a part in which the dead poets are mirrored vigorously. So when we say the dead poets, Eliot means tradition. So the poets who came before or the ancestors are very important when an individual's work is taken for study. So he asserts that tradition and individuality go together. It's the right proportion of tradition and individuality that makes a work a masterpiece. 2, he says that tradition and historical sense are connected. He says that if the form of tradition remained only in blind adherence of dead people or ancestors, then it would be lost or such tradition should be destroyed. So he also says that even if you have to follow tradition, do not blindly adhere to tradition. Do not blindly, cut, copy, paste from your ancestors. In that sense, tradition is a negative term. So, the word tradition carries a wider meaning here. And Eliot believes that tradition and historical sense are connected. According to Eliot, novelty can also be found in every tradition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance according to Eliot. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves in first place the historical sense. Now, what is this historical sense? What does Eliot mean by the phrase historical sense? According to Eliot, historical sense is inevitable for a poet. So it's not the poet's choice, to accept the historical sense. It is inevitable. And with this historical sense, they should have perception about its presence as well as about its pastness of past. So this exactly is the explanation or the meaning of the term, a phrase historical sense. The pastness of the past is important when a writer writes a piece of work in the present. This historical sense forces a man or a poet to write not only with his own generation, but with the whole age of English literature. So the historical sense makes a poet to feel that the whole of the literature from Homer and the whole of the literature of his generation has a simultaneous existence. They are interconnected. One cannot do without the other. So this concept of the historical sense harmonizes two different concepts. One, it brings in timelessness, and two, temporality in a poet's work. Timelessness because it is connected to all the works of the masters of the past, and temporality because it also talks about what is happening today. So historical sense brings together timelessness and temporality in a poet's work. So this makes a poet traditional. So this is the meaning of the word traditional. It does not mean that you blindly copy the old ancestors or the masters who came before you. Eliot believes that no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. So no artist can exist alone. Every artist and every piece of art has a trace of the past in it. So the significance of the art and the artist is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. So you cannot value a poet or an artist all alone. You can only see him in contrast and comparison to the dead poets who came before him. And I quote, Eliot says, "The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. Thus, the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, continual extinction of personality." So a poet always has to take care of two things. One, tradition, which means the pastness of the past, and also he has to take care of what is happening at present. So bringing together timelessness and temporality completely takes away the personality of the. So when past and present are being measured in a poet's work, Eliot says that in this case, a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past is seen. A poet cannot use the past as a shapeless mass. He cannot fit himself in one or two private admirations. And also, he cannot fit himself in one preferred period. So, Eliot believes that art never improves, but the substance of art is changing. So it is the concept of art, the theme of art, that keeps changing from time to time. It does not mean that art is improving. Art is always constant. So he talks about the importance of tradition, the importance of individual talent, and also the coming together of tradition and individual talent plus the pastness of the past. So at the end of the first part, he says that he comes to the point of depersonalization. This is what he talks about in the second part in a more well explained manner. In the second part, Eliot says that depersonalization, thus, is very important when it comes to the sense of tradition, because it is this aspect that makes tradition become more clear in a piece of work. He says that in most of the criticisms we find the name and the creativity of the poet, but when we seek for enjoyment of the poetry, we seldom check about who the poet is or his details. Now, in this part, Eliot says that the difference between mature and immature poets can be found out by the liberty of special and very varied feelings that can enter into new combinations. So, this, according to Eliot, is the difference between a mature and an immature poet. For example, he gives an illustration from chemistry. In the process of making sulfurous acid, there are two gases needed. You need oxygen, you also need sulfur dioxide. And also they must have the presence of a filament, which is platinum. So he compares this platinum with the poet. In the whole process, the filament of platinum plays a vital, inevitable role. But this role is indirect. In the process, platinum remains quite unaffected by any of the gases. It remains inert, neutral, and unchanged. Similarly, the result that comes out from the process has no trace of platinum in it. So, Eliot insists that the mind of the poet should also be just like platinum. It should give its total contribution in creating poetry, and then it should leave away from the place being unaffected. So, according to Eliot, the poet's mind is like a utensil in which numerous feelings, phrases, and images can be stored, but none of it affects the poet's mind, or none of the personal feelings of the artist gets involved. So the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality. So the personality of the poet need not be shown in art or in a poem. What should be shown in a poem is tradition, individual talent, and the pastness of the past. This is what should be shown in a piece of art. So, a poet need not find new emotions, but he has to use ordinary emotions, one ingredient of a poem. He has to deal with every known unknown emotion. Eliot here twists emotion recollected in tranquility by Wordsworth, and he says that in an inexact formulae, to write poetry is a great deal. When a poet becomes personal when writing poetry, he is considered to be a bad poet. So who is a bad poet according to Eliot? A bad poet is someone or is a poet who puts in his personal ideas into poetry. Because then he becomes unconscious where he should be conscious, and he becomes conscious where he must be unconscious. So Eliot states that poets should not bring in their personal feelings, their personal positions, their personal ideas or decisions into poetry. When a poet escapes from his personality, from his emotions, from expressing his ideas, only then a great poem comes out. So, which means a poet must not show his emotion in poetry. This, according to Eliot, is called as depersonalization. You have to stay, your personality has to be kept away from the poetry that you are singing. So, one, he talks about tradition, he talks about the skill of a poet, he talks about timelessness, he talks about pastness of past, and Eliot also talks about how all this should be brought together to make a perfect art. 2, he talks about the theory of depersonalization, wherein, just like the shreds of platinum, a poet should stay away from the piece of art by only providing what he has, what he's supposed to provide, and it's not his emotions that are to be shown in his art. Only then he will be able to create a great piece of poem or art. So thus in conclusion, Eliot says that there are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in verse, and there is a smaller number of people who can appreciate technical excellence. But very few know when there is an expression of significant emotion which has its life in poem and not in the history of the poet. So according to Eliot, the poet or his background is not at all important. The technical skill and the emotion conveyed in the content of the poem is important. So by this statement, he says that to admire a poem with the poet's skill and his mien is very easy. The harder thing is to know the technical skill or the art of the poem. And it is the hardest thing to find the significant emotions from the poem, which separates the poet from the poem. So all these are the important ingredients of a great work or a great poem. The reader must know that after a work of art is produced, the connection between the art and the artist gets broken or gets severed. And a poet must know that to reach that level of impersonality, he first has to sacrifice himself and then has to surrender himself totally to the piece of art or the work. So these are the two important concepts that Eliot talks about in his essay, The Tradition and Individual Talent.